They laughed when the single dad bought the condemned boat. 3 weeks later, the Coast Guard came knocking, asking for him by name, not his bank account. The receipt sat folded in Garrett Wade's palm, edges softened from being handled too many times in the last hour. $1,200 cash, everything left after rent, after groceries, after the electric bill that had come with a final notice stamp 3 days ago. The skiff rocked against the dock at Harborview Marina, 28 feet of blistered paint and rust-streaked metal, a bright orange condemned tag swinging from the cleat like a verdict already delivered. A woman in a white blazer stood near the harbormaster's office, platinum bracelet catching the afternoon sun. Margaret Ashford, chairwoman of the Marina Board, her voice carried across polished teak decks and gleaming brass rails with the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "You're blocking paying members. Security, move him." Garrett didn't argue. He tucked the receipt into his shirt pocket, feeling the weight of eyes on his back, on the patched knees of his Carhartt work pants, on the 9-year-old boy standing beside him with a dented Spider-Man lunchbox clutched in both hands. Cole's eyes tracked the crowd, cataloging every smirk, every whispered comment that drifted across salt air like smoke. The old instinct kicked in before Garrett could stop it. Take the hit so your child doesn't have to. He shifted slightly, putting his body between Cole and the nearest cluster of onlookers, and started untying the lines as if the laughter wasn't real, as if Margaret Ashford's contempt was just weather he'd learned to work through. Someone muttered something about custody plans and floating time limits. Garrett's hands stilled for half a second on the rope, then continued with the same steady rhythm. Cole's fingers tightened on the lunchbox handle. The boy had heard it too. "Hey," Garrett said quietly, crouching to eye level. "Eyes on me. We're okay." They weren't okay. The rent notice was folded in his other pocket, the one he hadn't shown Cole yet. $18.50 a month, jumping to $2,200 starting July 1st, and the landlord had made it clear there would be no extensions, no payment plans, no exceptions for single fathers working dock repair at $18 an hour. But panic spread fast, especially to kids who'd already watched their mother remarry into a 2-story colonial in Atlanta with a banker who wore cufflinks and drove a car that cost more than Garrett made in 2 years. Calm could be a shield if you held it steady enough. Margaret approached, heels clicking against weathered planks. Perfume cut through the smell of diesel and brine, something expensive and deliberate. "You can't work on that here. Insurance won't allow amateurs." Garrett glanced at the cracked transom, then at the row of yachts shining like trophies in their assigned slips. "I'm not working on yours. I bought mine." Her smile tightened, a hairline fracture in the facade. It wasn't the boat that offended her. It was the word mine. "Security," she repeated, this time looking past Garrett as if he'd already ceased to exist. 2 men in polo shirts with marina logos stepped forward. One of them, younger, maybe mid-20s, let his gaze flick to Cole before looking away. That tiny pause told Garrett everything he needed to know. Even here, the sight of a child could bend a script, make people remember they were still human underneath the job description. They ushered Garrett and Cole off the main pier, handed him a stack of paperwork like it was contaminated, and pointed toward the maintenance yard. Margaret was already on her phone, heels fading into the distance, voice carrying fragments about standards and image and appropriate clientele. The maintenance yard sat behind fuel drums and stacked pallets. The place power never looked. Diesel fumes mixed with the honest clank of metal on metal. The hum of generators doing work that kept the showpiece marina running. A man leaned out from an engine bay, grease-stained rag in one hand, eyebrows lifting as Garrett guided the skiff toward an empty stretch of cracked concrete. "You're the guy who bought the condemned boat, not a question." The man's voice carried the texture of someone who'd spent decades breathing salt air and engine exhaust in equal measure. Garrett nodded. The man let out a low whistle, either brave or broke. Garrett's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Both. The man wiped his hands, extended one. Rusty Polk, head mechanic. Been here 15 years. Garrett weighed. Garrett shook, feeling calluses that matched his own. This is Cole. Cole managed a small wave, still clutching the lunchbox. Rusty's expression softened just enough to be noticeable. 9 years old and already learning the geography of rejection. The unspoken rules about who belonged where. Garrett climbed onto the deck and listened. Not to the laughter still fading from the main pier. Those voices were already bored, moving on to whatever spectacle came next, but to the hull's complaints. A creak here, a hollow note there. His mind mapped stress points without conscious effort, muscle memory from a life he'd walked away from 6 years ago. Reinforced ribs needed here, replace fasteners there, seal seams along the port side where water had been getting in for months, maybe years. He moved without announcing it, pulling worn gloves from his back pocket. The leather was old, stitched and restitched in places where the original seams had given out. The kind of gloves you kept when you trusted them in worse places than a North Carolina marina. A pale scar ran along his right wrist, half hidden when he flexed his hand, and Cole had asked about it once. "Work," Garrett had said, then changed the subject before the boy could dig deeper. Now, checking the bilge pump wiring and measuring draft with a scrap of line he'd pulled from his truck. Garrett's hands looked too sure for someone everyone had just dismissed as a nobody. Even Rusty paused in the engine bay, eyebrows lifting like he'd just seen the outline of some buried history he couldn't quite name. Cole knelt by a rusted hinge, carefully setting the lunchbox aside. "Can I help?" Garrett handed him a small brush and a bottle of solvent. "Clean the bolts, slow. Make sure you get into the threads." The boy's face lit up like he'd been given a job that mattered, like he was part of something instead of just a witness to his father's latest failure. Garrett watched for a moment, something in his chest loosening just enough to breathe, and then turned his attention back to the stern. He'd been thinking about reefs outside the breakwater, about storms that turned rich toys into wrecks, about what it took to survive when the water stopped caring about your pedigree. He told himself he was rebuilding a boat to fish, to earn, to have something solid when the custody hearing came in 8 weeks and Jennifer's lawyer started listing all the ways Garrett couldn't provide stability. But the truth underneath ran steadier and deeper. He was rebuilding his son's faith, plank by plank, showing Cole that condemned didn't mean finished, that broken could be fixed if you knew what you were doing and didn't quit when people laughed. Out on the main pier, Margaret Ashford's voice carried once more, sharp as a gull's cry. Garrett didn't look up. He set a wrench to the first corroded bolt and turned, steady and exact, like the sea was already counting down. The wrench stopped turning only when light shifted from gold to gray, the sun dropping toward the horizon and painting the harbor in shades of brass and shadow. Garrett wiped his hands on a rag already black with oil and grime, feeling Cole's eyes on him from where the boy sat cross-legged on the deck. Small brush still moving over a bolt that had probably been clean for the last 20 minutes. "You okay?" Cole asked quietly, voice carrying the kind of careful concern that 9-year-olds shouldn't have to master yet. Garrett nodded. "Yeah, long road, that's all." Across the yard, Rusty leaned against a battered tool chest, arms crossed. "You planning to berth that thing here? The board's not going to like it." "They don't have to," Garrett replied, checking the tension on a cleat he'd just installed. "I just need access to water." What he didn't say was that access cost money. Permits, temporary docking fees, safety inspections designed to discourage anyone without a polished hull, and a membership badge that started at $5,000 a year. The math didn't work. It never did. But Garrett had learned a long time ago that you didn't solve problems by staring at them. You broke them into pieces small enough to handle and dealt with one piece at a time. As if summoned by the thought, Margaret Ashford reappeared at the edge of the maintenance zone, heels clicking against concrete. She didn't step fully inside. People like her never did, as if the boundary between their world and the labor that kept it running was something they couldn't afford to cross. You've been informed that all restoration work requires approval. Her voice stayed crisp, each word landing with the weight of policy and precedent. Insurance liability, environmental compliance, security clearance. Garrett stepped down from the boat, placing himself subtly between her and Cole again. It's a private purchase. I'll handle it. Her eyes flicked over his boots, the grease-dark knees of his jeans, the scar on his wrist that he hadn't bothered to hide. Handle it? A soft laugh, the kind meant to sting. You can barely afford to dock it. The words hit where they were aimed, but Garrett kept his breathing slow, his expression neutral. I'll manage. Margaret studied him like he was a stain that wouldn't scrub out, something that offended the pristine image she'd spent 3 years building. You have 48 hours to remove that vessel from this marina, or we'll tow it ourselves. Cole stiffened on the deck, and Garrett felt it before he saw it, a tightening in the air that meant his son was holding his breath. Understood, Garrett answered evenly, giving her nothing to grab onto, no emotion she could twist into proof that he didn't belong. She turned, already dialing someone on her phone, the conversation beginning before she'd taken 3 steps. The message was clear enough. Power didn't shout when it could schedule, didn't argue when it could simply execute. Silence settled after she left, broken only by the distant clang of a halyard against a mast and the low thrum of generators keeping the fuel pumps running. Rusty shook his head, expression caught somewhere between sympathy and resignation. She's serious. You got somewhere else to take it? Garrett glanced toward the breakwater beyond the slips, the line where controlled water met open ocean. The old municipal ramp sat on the far side of the harbor, barely maintained, shallow and debris-laced in ways that kept luxury yachts away. No prestige, no polish, just tide and risk and people who worked boats instead of collecting them. Yeah, he said finally. I've got somewhere. They worked faster after that. Garrett stripped out rotted floorboards with controlled efficiency, each movement economical and precise. He reinforced ribs with salvaged marine-grade aluminum he'd sourced from a scrapyard 3 weeks ago, back when this plan had been nothing more than a half-formed idea and a desperate hope. Every measurement exact, every bolt torqued to specification, nothing left to chance or approximation. Rusty watched in quiet curiosity, the kind that came from recognizing skill that didn't match the story. You've done this before? Garrett didn't look up from the seam he was sealing. Something like it. The understatement hung in the air, heavy with everything Garrett wasn't saying. Rusty didn't push. People who worked with their hands learned early that some histories didn't want to be spoken, that silence was its own kind of respect. As evening deepened, harbor patrol sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Nothing urgent, just routine traffic control. But Garrett's head tilted instinctively, calculating wind direction, current pull, the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that most people couldn't feel, but that sailors and divers learned to read like a second language. You hear that? Rusty asked. Yeah, storm front's coming early. The weather service pushed the advisory up. Garrett nodded once. He'd seen the forecast models that morning, the ones buried 3 clicks deep on the NOAA site that most casual boaters never bothered to check. Tropical storm Iris, currently sitting 200 miles offshore, expected landfall in 72 hours. The marina had weathered worse, or so everyone kept saying. But Garrett had learned to trust pressure drops and current shifts over confidence and historical precedent. Cole wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his temple. Dad, why are we adding extra reinforcement on the bow? Garrett paused, considering how much to say, how much a 9-year-old needed to carry. Because shallow water lies, looks calm, hides teeth. The boy absorbed that, filing it away in whatever mental catalog he kept of his father's lessons. By midnight, they'd moved the boat to the municipal ramp under a sky gone dark and heavy with clouds that hadn't been there at sunset. The ramp was exactly what Garrett had expected. Cracked concrete, flickering sodium lights, rust stains on the bollards. But no one there cared what you owned or where you came from. They just cared whether you knew what you were doing. Garrett secured the lines, double-checking each knot with hands that moved on autopilot. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again 30 seconds later, insistent. He stepped aside away from where Cole was organizing tools in the truck bed and answered without greeting. A clipped voice responded. "Mr. Wade, this is Marina Compliance. You're in violation of section..." He ended the call without speaking, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Rusty blinked from where he'd been coiling extra line. "Bold. No point arguing," Garrett said quietly. They'd already decided. He crouched beside Cole, keeping his voice low. "Listen, tomorrow might get loud. People don't like being told no." Cole looked toward the distant lights of the luxury marina, warm and golden against the darkening sky. "Are we going to lose the boat?" Garrett held his son's gaze, seeing Jennifer's eyes staring back at him, the same shade of hazel that had once meant home before it meant custody agreements and supervised visitation. "Not if I can help it." There it was again, that calm certainty that didn't match his bank account, that came from somewhere deeper than money or status or the approval of people like Margaret Ashford. He checked the fuel lines one more time, adjusted the bilge pump, installed a secondary manual override that most casual boat owners wouldn't even think about. "Why 2 systems?" Cole asked, watching his father work. "Because when one fails," Garrett said quietly, "you don't get a second chance." Wind picked up off the water, slicing colder now, carrying the smell of storm beneath the usual salt and diesel. White caps flickered beyond the breakwater, small but growing. The ocean starting to flex muscles it had kept relaxed through weeks of summer calm. On the far side of the harbor, music from the marina's private lounge drifted faintly across the dark. Laughter, glasses clinking, a world insulated from tide charts and pressure systems and the consequences of unpreparedness. Garrett secured the final latch and stepped back, studying the boat in the sodium light's jaundiced glow. It no longer looked condemned. The hull sat lower in the water now, weighted with reinforcement and intention, the deck clear of debris, every line coiled and ready. It looked deliberate, purposeful, like something that knew what it was built for and wasn't apologizing. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where satellite data tracked convection patterns and wind shear, pressure was building in ways the forecast models were only beginning to understand. Garrett didn't know yet how soon that pressure would matter. How many hours separated this moment from the one where everything Margaret Ashford had built would require exactly the kind of preparation she'd spent 3 years dismissing. But the sea knew. The sea always knew. It was just waiting for people to stop pretending they were in control. He helped Cole into the truck, buckling the seatbelt and checking twice that it was secure, then climbed into the driver's seat and sat for a moment in the dark cab. The marina lights gleamed across the water, safe and warm and utterly certain of their permanence. Garrett started the engine and pulled away, leaving them behind. The drive home took 15 minutes through streets that got shabbier the farther they moved from the waterfront. Garrett's rental sat in a neighborhood where chain-link fences outnumbered picket versions, where cars leaked oil onto cracked driveways and security lights stayed on all night because trust had worn thin years ago. He parked in front of a weathered duplex with vinyl siding that had probably been white once, but had faded to the color of old newspaper. Inside, the air hung close and stale despite the window unit struggling in the living room. Garrett dropped his keys on the counter, noting the blinking light on the ancient answering machine he kept meaning to disconnect. 2 messages. He didn't check them. They'd be the landlord or Jennifer's lawyer or someone from the electric company asking when they could expect payment. None of it would change between now and morning. Cole headed straight for the bathroom, and Garrett heard the shower start, heard his son's tired movements through the thin walls. He opened the fridge, staring at its sparse contents. Milk that would go bad in 2 days, half a pack of deli turkey, condiments taking up more space than actual food. He closed it again without taking anything out. The rent notice sat on the kitchen table where he'd left it that morning. $2,200 a month starting July 1st, 4 weeks away. He did the math automatically, a habit from years of calculating oxygen consumption and dive time limits, and the precise moment when you had to abort a mission or risk not coming back. $18 an hour, 40 hours a week if he was lucky. Taxes pulling out a quarter before he ever saw it. The numbers didn't balance. They hadn't balanced in months, but he'd been making it work through a combination of skipped meals and deferred maintenance and the kind of creative accounting that meant robbing Peter to pay Paul and hoping Peter didn't notice. The custody hearing loomed 8 weeks out, circled in red on the calendar hanging crooked beside the fridge. Late August. Jennifer's lawyer had already made it clear what angles they'd work. Financial instability, inadequate housing, inability to provide educational opportunities. The boat was supposed to be the answer, proof that Garrett could generate income beyond hourly dock work, that he had a plan and the skill to execute it. But that only worked if he could keep the boat, if he could navigate the 48-hour ultimatum Margaret had delivered like a prison sentence. Cole emerged from the bathroom in oversized pajamas, hair still damp, eyes heavy with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tired. "You think Mom's lawyer's gonna ask about the boat?" Garrett turned from the fridge, caught off guard by how much the boy saw, how little he missed despite Garrett's best efforts to shield him. "Probably." Cole nodded, processing that with the same careful attention he gave to everything these days, like he was building an internal map of how the world worked and where he fit into it. "Are you scared?" The question landed harder than it should have, cutting through the careful neutral mask Garrett had worn all day. He could have lied, could have given the easy answer that fathers were supposed to give, the one about everything being fine and not to worry. But Cole had already watched his mother leave, had already heard the whispers about custody and stability, had already learned that adults lied when they thought kids couldn't handle truth. "Yeah," Garrett said quietly, "sometimes. But being scared doesn't mean you quit." Cole absorbed that, then nodded again and headed for the small bedroom they shared, the one with bunk beds Garrett had built from 2x4s and determination because buying furniture meant money he didn't have. Garrett waited until he heard the creak of springs, the rustle of sheets, before moving to the window and looking out at the street. A car passed, headlights sweeping across peeling paint and chain-link shadows. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and went silent. The neighborhood settled into its nighttime rhythm, the kind of quiet that came from exhaustion rather than peace. Garrett's phone buzzed again. Different number this time. He almost ignored it, then saw the 252 area code. Local, not Atlanta. He answered. "Mr. Wade," a young voice, uncertain. "This is Travis Boone, Harbor Patrol trainee." Garrett waited, saying nothing. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. The board's filing a formal complaint tomorrow morning. They're claiming your vessel is a hazard. Magistrate's office, 9 a.m. "Why are you telling me this?" A pause long enough that Garrett heard wind through the phone, the sound of someone standing outside near water. "Because that boat you're working on? I watched you reinforce the hull today. That's not amateur work, and I've seen what happens when people who don't know what they're doing try to ride out a storm." Garrett closed his eyes, feeling the weight of recognition, of being seen by someone who understood the difference between competence and credentials. "Thanks for the call." He disconnected before the conversation could go anywhere else. Before Travis could ask questions, Garrett didn't want to answer about where he'd learned structural engineering or why his hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions a lot worse than a North Carolina marina. 9 a.m. Tomorrow meant missing work, meant losing 8 hours of pay he couldn't afford to lose, meant standing in front of a magistrate and explaining why a condemned boat and a single father's desperation should count for something. But it also meant showing up, meant not folding when power expected him to disappear quietly. He checked the weather app on his phone one more time. Tropical storm. Iris had intensified, winds now sustained at 60 miles per hour, projected path taking it straight toward the Outer Banks. Landfall in 72 hours, maybe less if the steering currents shifted the way the European model suggested. The marina was posting updates about securing vessels and checking dock lines, all routine procedures that assumed everyone knew what they were doing. Garrett opened his laptop, an 8-year-old Dell that took 2 minutes to boot and wheezed like an asthmatic whenever he asked it to run more than 2 programs at once. He pulled up the NOAA marine forecast, the raw data that meteorologists used before translating it into language civilians could understand. Barometric pressure dropping faster than the public forecast acknowledged. Sea surface temperatures elevated, wind shear decreasing. He opened a blank document and started taking notes, calculating surge height based on storm track and bathymetric charts he'd memorized years ago. The breakwater at Harborview sat at mean high water designed to handle normal tidal variation and moderate storm surge. But Iris was tracking to hit at high tide during a full moon, and the fetch distance meant waves would build momentum across miles of open ocean before slamming into the barrier. He ran the numbers twice, checking his math, hoping he was wrong. Surge torque at the inner slips would exceed structural tolerance by 12%, maybe 15% if the storm wobbled north. The cleat spacing Margaret's board had approved 3 years ago. The same spacing that looked fine on paper and met minimum code requirements. Wouldn't absorb the rebound load when that surge hit the breakwater and came rushing back. Garrett sat back, staring at the numbers on the screen. Next storm won't crack fiberglass, he thought. It'll rip the posts out entirely. He should tell someone, should call the harbor master, should file a report, should do something with this information besides letting it sit in a document on a dying laptop. But who would listen? The dock mechanic with the condemned boat, the single father who couldn't afford membership fees, the man Margaret Ashford had ordered removed like contaminated cargo. They'd dismissed him before he'd even opened his mouth. So instead, he saved the file, backed it up on a thumb drive that lived in his glove box, and shut down the laptop. He checked on Cole once more, found the boy asleep with one arm hanging off the bunk, face peaceful in a way it never was during waking hours. Garrett pulled the blanket up, careful not to wake him, and stood there for a moment just watching his son breathe. Everything he'd done for the last 6 years, the medical discharge he'd accepted instead of fighting, the move to North Carolina where Jennifer's family couldn't track him as easily, the dock work that paid enough to survive but not enough to thrive. All of it came down to this: keeping Cole safe, keeping Cole close, making sure the boy had at least one parent who showed up, who kept promises, who didn't disappear when things got hard. Garrett moved to the living room and lay down on the couch that doubled as his bed, springs digging into his back through a cushion that had given up any pretense of comfort years ago. Sleep wouldn't come easy tonight if it came at all. His mind kept turning over calculations and contingencies, running through scenarios where the storm hit harder or earlier than predicted, where the marina's infrastructure failed in the specific ways he knew it would fail. But there was another calculation running underneath, one that had nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with the look on Cole's face when the yacht owner had joked about custody plans floating away with condemned boats. The hearing was 8 weeks out, 48 hours from now, the boat would be towed if Garrett couldn't convince a magistrate to give him more time. And 72 hours from now, a storm was coming that would prove whether Margaret Ashford's 3 years of control meant anything against physics and preparation. Garrett closed his eyes, feeling the scar on his wrist where the cable had cut deep 6 years ago during a rescue gone wrong, where Marcus Holt's blood had clouded the water and Garrett's hands had shaken so badly afterward that the mission commander had pulled him off active duty for psychiatric evaluation. The nightmares had faded eventually, the guilt settling into something he could carry instead of something that crushed him. But the lesson had stayed sharp. When one system fails, you don't get a second chance. That's why he'd installed 2 bilge pumps. That's why he'd reinforced the hull beyond what the boat would ever need for calm water fishing. That's why he'd calculated surge torque and rebound dynamics for a storm that might veer off course and miss them entirely. Because if it didn't miss, if Iris came exactly where the models predicted and hit exactly when the physics demanded, then preparation would be the only thing standing between survival and disaster. And Garrett Wade had learned a long time ago that the people who laughed the loudest were usually the ones who'd never had to save their own lives when everything else failed. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window unit and sending something metallic clanging down the street. The first scattered drops of rain hit the roof, tentative and light, a preview of what was building offshore. Garrett lay there listening, counting seconds between gusts, feeling the rhythm of something gathering strength. Tomorrow he'd stand in front of a magistrate and fight for 48 more hours. Tomorrow he'd face Margaret Ashford's contempt again and Travis Boone's careful neutrality and whatever paperwork the marina's lawyers had prepared to make the problem of Garrett Wade disappear into administrative process. But tonight, in the dark of a duplex that smelled like mildew and old carpet, with his son sleeping 10 feet away and a storm bearing down on people who'd stopped believing they could drown, Garrett Wade let himself acknowledge the truth he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd handed over $1,200 for a boat everyone said was worthless. This wasn't about fishing. It wasn't even really about the custody hearing, though that mattered more than anything else in his world. This was about proving, to Cole, to himself, maybe even to the memory of Marcus Holt, that condemned didn't mean finished, that broken could be fixed, and that sometimes the people everyone laughed at were the only ones prepared when the laughter finally stopped. He opened his eyes again, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like continents he'd never visit, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd show up. He'd speak when spoken to, answer questions with the minimum necessary truth, and buy whatever time the system would sell him. And then he'd get back to work, because 72 hours wasn't much, but it was enough if you didn't waste a single minute. The rain picked up outside, steady now instead of tentative. Garrett listened to it drum against aluminum siding and thought about water, about how it always found the weakness, always tested the preparation, always separated what was solid from what just looked that way. And in the dark, behind his closed eyes, he saw Margaret Ashford's white blazer and perfect bracelet. Saw her standing on a pier she thought she controlled. Saw the moment coming when she'd realize that power and preparation weren't the same thing. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The magistrate's office smelled like old carpet and bureaucratic patience worn thin. Garrett sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3. Cole beside him with the Spider-Man lunchbox balanced on his knees, both of them watching lawyers in expensive suits glide past like they owned the building's oxygen. 9:17 a.m. They'd been waiting 43 minutes. A clerk emerged, reading from a clipboard without looking up. Wade versus Harborview Marina Board, courtroom 3. The room was smaller than Garrett expected. Fluorescent lights washing everything in the same shade of institutional beige. Margaret Ashford sat at the plaintiff's table with a man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly styled, briefcase that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. The man didn't introduce himself, just opened a folder and began reciting municipal codes like scripture. "Your Honor, The vessel in question has been deemed unseaworthy by certified marine surveyors. Municipal Code 17-4 requires removal of hazardous watercraft within 48 hours of notification. The magistrate, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, looked at Garrett. "You have representation, Mr. Wade?" "No, ma'am. Just me." She waited, pen hovering over a legal pad. "And your response to the complaint?" Garrett stood, feeling Cole's eyes on his back. "The boat's not hazardous. I've reinforced the hull, replaced the bilge system, upgraded the electrical. It's safer now than half the vessels berthed at their main slips." The lawyer smiled without warmth. "Mr. Wade claims expertise, but his employment record shows dock maintenance, not structural certification. The marina has insurance liability concerns that supersede personal opinion." "I'm not giving an opinion." Garrett heard his voice steady itself, muscle memory from years of briefing officers who outranked him. "I'm stating fact. That boat will handle conditions their luxury fleet can't." The magistrate raised her hand, stopping the lawyer before he could respond. "Mr. Wade, do you have documentation? Engineering assessments? Certification from a licensed surveyor?" "No, ma'am, just the work itself. Then I'm afraid the marina's position is legally sound. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to relocate the vessel beyond municipal jurisdiction." Cole's lunchbox hit the floor, the metallic clang cutting through the room's careful neutrality. Garrett didn't turn around. 24 hours instead of 48, but it was still time, still a window. "Thank you, Your Honor." Outside, the sky had darkened from morning gray to something heavier, clouds stacking up offshore like a declaration of intent. Cole walked beside him without speaking, and Garrett let the silence hold until they reached the truck. "I'm sorry." The words came out small and tight. "I thought you could—" "Hey." Garrett crouched to eye level, hands on his son's shoulders. "We're not done. We just have less time than I wanted." The drive back to the municipal ramp took them past the main marina, where crews were already moving with purpose that hadn't existed 2 days ago. Storm shutters going up on the harbor master's office, lines being checked, fenders adjusted. But Garrett saw the shortcuts, the casual confidence of people who'd weathered storms before and assumed this one would be the same. Travis Boone stood near the fuel dock, talking into a radio clipped to his shoulder. He caught Garrett's eye as the truck rolled past, gave a small nod that acknowledged something unspoken. The kid had tried to help. That counted for something in a world where most people just looked the other way. At the ramp, Rusty was already working, welding torch-throwing blue-white sparks across a damaged propeller shaft. He killed the flame when Garrett climbed out, pushing his safety visor up. "How'd it go?" 24 hours. Garrett pulled his gloves from his back pocket. "After that, they can tow." Rusty swore quietly, creatively. "Where you gonna take it?" Garrett looked at the water beyond the breakwater, at swells building higher than they'd been at dawn. "Nowhere. We finish the work here, and when the storm comes, we'll see who prepared right." The mechanic studied him for a long moment, reading something in Garrett's expression that made him nod slowly. "You're gonna need help. I get off at 3. Cole was already climbing onto the deck, setting the lunchbox down and reaching for the toolkit they'd left secured under a tarp. Garrett followed, and they worked in rhythm that had become familiar over the past weeks, father and son moving around each other with the kind of coordination that came from shared purpose and limited space. By noon, they'd installed reinforced brackets along the starboard rail and rerouted the auxiliary power to run independent of the main system. Garrett kept checking his phone, watching the storm track update every hour. Iris had intensified overnight, sustained winds now at 70 miles per hour, forward speed increasing. The cone of uncertainty had narrowed, centering directly on the outer banks. Landfall projected for early morning, roughly 60 hours out. A Lexus pulled into the ramp's gravel lot, out of place among work trucks and rust bucket sedans. Margaret Ashford stepped out, this time in navy instead of white, hair pulled back severe and practical. She walked toward the boat with purpose that looked almost like urgency, heels clicking until they hit the ramp's weathered planks and the sound went dull. "Mr. Wade," her voice carried across the water, formal and controlled. "I need to speak with you." Garrett climbed down, wiping his hands. Cole stayed on deck, watching. "My daughter is missing." Margaret's composure cracked just slightly around the edges, a hairline fracture in expensive veneer. "She took a jet ski past the breakwater markers this morning, against my explicit instructions. The Coast Guard has been notified, but their cutter can't navigate the shallow zone in current conditions." Garrett felt something shift in his chest, the old training kicking in before conscious thought could catch up. "How long?" 2 hours, maybe more. Her voice threatened to break completely. "The luxury rescue boats can't get close enough. The draft is too deep and they'll ground on the shoals." "Where exactly?" "Past the third marker, near the rock shelf." She was trying to... Margaret stopped, swallowed whatever she'd been about to say. She was trying to prove she wasn't afraid. Garrett looked at his boat, at the reinforced hull and shallow draft and systems he'd spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of water. Then he looked at Margaret Ashford, at the woman who'd dismissed him as contaminated cargo, who'd ordered him removed like trash, who was now standing on a dock she'd never visit under normal circumstances because her daughter was drowning and power couldn't save her. "Cole." Garrett's voice came out steady, the way it always did when panic would spread faster than help. "Stay with Rusty." The boy nodded, understanding in his eyes going deeper than his years should allow. "You're coming back. Always." Garrett fired the engine, feeling it catch clean and strong, all the late nights and careful maintenance paying off in the single smooth rotation of machinery that knew its job. He cast off the lines, throttle forward, and the boat responded like it had been waiting for this moment since the day he bought it. The municipal ramp fell away behind him as he navigated toward open water. Wind had picked up significantly, spray coming off the bow in sheets that tasted like salt and adrenaline. The breakwater loomed ahead, waves already slamming against it with force, that sent white columns 20 feet into gray air. His phone buzzed. Travis Boone's voice came through, tight with stress. "Mr. Wade, you're not cleared for rescue operations." "I'm not conducting a rescue operation." Garrett adjusted his heading to avoid a debris field he could see building near the second marker. "I'm checking on my fishing equipment." "Sir, that's..." Travis stopped, seemed to recalculate. "Coast Guard ETA is 8 minutes. Commander Drake specifically said to hold position. Tell the commander I'll be the one holding position when she gets here." The third marker appeared through spray and chop, bright orange and tilting at an angle that meant the anchoring chain had started to give way. Beyond it, the rock shelf lay hidden beneath water that looked deceptively smooth until you understood what calm surface meant over shallow stone. Garrett throttled down, letting momentum carry him forward while his eyes scanned for wreckage. There, a flash of overturned fiberglass, bright yellow against gray water. The jet ski, hull up, tow line trailing like a failed umbilical, and beside it something else, a hand breaking the surface for half a second before disappearing again. Garrett killed the engine at precisely the right moment, muscle memory from 1,000 approaches in worse conditions, and the boat glided close enough that he could see her now. Lauren Ashford, 16 years old, tangled in the tow line that should have kept her safe but was instead pulling her under every time she tried to surface. He stripped off his jacket in one motion and locked the wheel with a quick-release clamp he'd installed without explaining why. The water would be 58 degrees, maybe 60. Cold enough to steal breath, warm enough that he had minutes instead of seconds. He dove clean, cutting through surface tension into a world gone quiet except for the dull roar of waves hitting rock. Visibility dropped to maybe 6 feet through the murk of stirred sediment and debris. Garrett kicked deeper, following the line of rope that disappeared into darker water. His lungs already starting to burn with the particular ache that came from breath holding under stress. The tow line had wrapped around Lauren's left ankle 3 times, then tangled through the jet ski's anchor cable in a knot that would take minutes to untangle by hand. She was unconscious, face pale, eyes closed, bubbles escaping from her nose in slowing intervals. That meant her body was shutting down, conserving oxygen it didn't have. Garrett reached for the dive knife clipped to his belt, the one he'd installed on the boat 2 weeks ago when Cole asked why they needed a knife on a fishing vessel. His hand touched the handle and froze. 6 years collapsed into 6 seconds. Marcus Holt's face behind the diving mask, blood clouding the water, the cable wrapped around his thigh just like this rope wrapped around Lauren's ankle, the choice that had ended one career and haunted every dream since. Cut fast and risk severing the artery, or work slow and watch someone drown. Garrett's hand shook, pressure building in his chest that had nothing to do with oxygen debt and everything to do with the weight of getting it wrong when wrong meant death. Lauren's pulse fluttered against his fingers when he checked her neck. Weak, failing, running out of time in a countdown measured in heartbeats instead of minutes. His phone, waterproof and clipped to his belt, buzzed against his hip. Cole's voice came through the earpiece he'd forgotten he was wearing, tinny and small and absolutely certain. "Dad, you there?" The question cut through 6 years of doubt like a blade through water. "Yes, son, I'm here." His hand steadied. The knife came out smooth and sure, and Garrett positioned the blade against the rope where it crossed itself, away from flesh and artery and all the ways this could go wrong. One precise cut, pressure applied exactly where physics demanded, and the line fell away in a bloom of released tension. Lauren jerked as the weight released, and Garrett grabbed her before the current could pull her deeper. He kicked toward the surface, one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other pulling water in strokes that counted seconds because counting kept panic away, and panic killed faster than cold or depth. They broke surface just as a wave slammed the breakwater 50 yards away, the impact shaking water and air in ways that made his teeth ache. Garrett rolled Lauren onto her back, cleared her airway with fingers that had done this 100 times in training and twice in situations where it mattered, and started compressions against her sternum with the heel of his hand. "Come on, kid." The words came out quiet, almost gentle. "Breathe." Water spilled from her mouth, then her lungs hitched and she coughed, violent and wet and alive. Her eyes opened, hazel like her mother's, confused and terrified and focusing on him with recognition that didn't make sense yet. The Coast Guard cutter roared into view, Commander Helen Drake standing at the rail in full gear, binoculars trained on Garrett treading water with an unconscious teenager who'd just started breathing again. The cutter couldn't get closer, draft too deep for the shoals, but Drake's voice carried across the gap through a bullhorn that cut through wind and wave noise. "Mr. Wade, hold position. We're deploying the rescue swimmer." Already holding, Garrett called back, one arm keeping Lauren's head above water while the other worked to stay afloat. The swimmer hit the water 30 seconds later, cutting through chop with practiced efficiency. And between them they got Lauren secured in a rescue basket that the cutter's crew hauled aboard with controlled urgency. Drake extended a hand to pull Garrett up last, her grip iron strong and her eyes tracking his face like she was cataloging details for a report she'd already started writing in her head. That wasn't luck. You knew exactly where to find her. "Spent time around these waters," Garrett managed, breathing hard now that adrenaline was draining and leaving exhaustion in its wake. The commander didn't respond immediately, just studied him while her crew worked on Lauren. Oxygen mask, thermal blanket, vital signs called out in the practiced shorthand of people who'd done this enough times to make it routine. Then she pulled out her phone, stepped away from the rail, and made a call that Garrett couldn't hear over engine noise and wind. When she came back, her expression had shifted into something harder to read. Garrett Wade, former Navy rescue diver, separated 2018. 2 commendations for underwater extraction operations. Medical discharge following incident in Florida Keys during Hurricane Michael relief. She paused, letting that information settle. You want to tell me why a decorated rescue diver is working as a dock mechanic? Wanted a quiet life, Garrett said, knowing it sounded weak even as he said it. Drake's mouth tightened. Well, you just made it considerably louder. The cutter turned back toward the marina, navigating carefully through water that was getting rougher by the hour. Lauren had started coughing more regularly now, good signs that her lungs were clearing, and the medic gave Drake a thumbs up that meant stable for transport. They'd take her to the hospital in Elizabeth City, run tests, keep her overnight for observation. But she'd live because Garrett Wade had remembered how to cut a rope without cutting the person attached to it. Back at the main marina, chaos had replaced the morning's casual preparation. A 40-foot cruiser had broken loose from its mooring, the surge already strong enough to overwhelm cleats that hadn't been secured properly. It slammed into 2 neighboring vessels with the sound of fiberglass splintering. Expensive hulls cracking like eggshells against physics they hadn't been designed to handle. Margaret stood at the edge of the main pier, phone pressed to her ear, giving orders that no one seemed able to execute fast enough. Her navy blazer was soaked through from spray, hair escaping its careful arrangement, the polished veneer finally dissolving under pressure that money couldn't deflect. Garrett climbed off the cutter onto the dock and moved without asking permission. "Shift weight starboard," he called to a crew struggling with a yacht that was listing dangerously. "Don't pull against the surge, angle with it." They obeyed without questioning, without checking credentials or asking who he was, because competence in a crisis spoke louder than any introduction. Garrett vaulted onto an unstable dock section and retied a drifting stern line with knots that locked under tension instead of slipping, the way amateur sailors always tied them. Another wave hit, but this time the cruiser held. Margaret appeared beside him, close enough that he could see water beating on her jacket, close enough that her voice didn't need volume to carry. "Can you stabilize the outer slips?" He studied the water pattern for 2 seconds, reading current and rebound like a language most people never learned. "Not with flow this strong. You need to release pressure first. Release how?" Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it level. "Loosen forward lines before they snap and take the posts with them." Her silence told him she'd never considered that possibility, that 3 years of running the marina had taught her how to manage people, but not how to manage water. Garrett moved again, directing deckhands who 6 hours ago wouldn't have met his eyes, pointing out fuel lines and exposed electrical cables and unsecured batteries. All the small failures that added up to catastrophe when storms stopped being theoretical. "Kill shore power on Dock C," he shouted toward Travis, who'd appeared with wide eyes and a radio clutched in one hand. "Now." The trainee ran and Garrett climbed onto another pitching section to secure 3 separate boats in under 90 seconds. Movements fluid and economical, every motion serving a purpose because wasted effort killed when you were working against a clock nobody could see. Margaret stepped closer, not maintaining the careful distance anymore, feet planted on weathered wood that bucked under wave impact. "How do you know all this?" Garrett tightened a final knot before answering. "You learn when you don't have backups." The statement landed heavier than accusation. One of the decorative regatta banners had torn free and wrapped itself around a spinning propeller, the motor screaming in protest before someone finally hit the kill switch. The sound cut through chaos like a blade, and in the sudden quiet that followed, people turned to look at Garrett. Not with contempt now, but with the desperate attention of drowning swimmers spotting a lifeguard. He guided them through quick, decisive corrections, redistributing weight, loosening lines before tension turned them into cutting wire. Somewhere in the blur of motion, someone said he saved the girl, and another voice responded, and now he's saving the whole marina, and the shift in tone was unmistakable, irreversible, the kind of change that happened when people stopped pretending they knew what they were doing and started listening to someone who actually did. Commander Drake's voice cut through from where she stood at the cutter's rail. "Mr. Wade, we need a statement about the rescue." Later, Garrett called back without stopping work. "You've got bigger problems arriving in 56 hours." Drake studied the water, the damaged boats, the frantic crews still struggling with lines they didn't understand. Then she pulled out her phone again and made another call, this one longer, punctuated by pauses where Garrett knew she was listening to someone important enough that even a Coast Guard commander took orders. When she disconnected, she walked down the pier until she stood directly in front of him, close enough that the conversation wouldn't carry. "You navigated those shoals like you had charts memorized. That's not recreational skill." Garrett met her gaze without flinching, did what needed doing. "No." Drake's voice dropped, became something harder and more precise. "You executed a shallow water extraction in low visibility with debris hazard. That's not amateur luck, Mr. Wade. That's professional training under conditions most people would abort." Around them, the marina had started to stabilize. The broken cruiser was secured, the loose lines retied properly, the immediate crisis bleeding into exhausted cleanup. But the wind hadn't stopped building, the waves hadn't stopped growing, and everyone who understood weather patterns knew this was just the warm-up act. Margaret approached again, and this time there was something different in how she held herself. Shoulders less rigid, expression stripped of the careful neutrality that usually masked everything beneath. "You saved my daughter." Her voice barely made it past her throat. "You went into water that would have killed most people, and you brought her back." Garrett wiped salt water from his face. "Ma'am, your inner slips are still at risk. When the surge rebounds off the breakwater, anything not secured to standard will tear loose." He didn't wait for gratitude, didn't need applause or recognition. Just facts delivered cleanly so people could make informed decisions about what came next. But Margaret wasn't moving, wasn't turning back to her phone and her authority and her careful distance. "I was wrong about you," she said finally, and the admission cost her something visible, some piece of the armor she'd worn for 3 years since her husband drowned. "Wrong about what you are, what you can do." Travis appeared at the edge of the crowd that had formed without anyone quite noticing, radio still in hand, but attention locked on Garrett. "Board's calling emergency session. They want a full safety audit before the storm hits." Garrett nodded once, already calculating how much could realistically get done in 56 hours if people actually listened instead of fighting. Tell them to start with cleat spacing on the inner slips and shore power isolation. Everything else is secondary. The trainee blinked. "You want me to tell the board what to do?" "I want you to tell them what physics is going to do if they keep pretending preparation is optional." A sound rippled through the gathered crowd. Not quite laughter, but something close to it. Recognition that power had just been told it didn't matter as much as competence. That 3 years of careful control had just been overridden by a man in work boots and grease-stained gloves who'd done in 2 hours what all their money and status couldn't accomplish. Cole appeared at the far end of the pier, lunchbox in hand, Rusty beside him. The boy's face split into something that looked like pride mixed with relief, and Garrett felt his chest tighten with emotion he didn't have time to process. His son had just watched him dive into killing water and come back, had heard him give orders to people who yesterday wouldn't acknowledge his existence, had seen the world rearrange itself around competence instead of credentials. "Dad!" Cole called, voice carrying clear across the dock. "You okay?" Garrett nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and Cole grinned. Pure and uncomplicated and absolutely certain that his father was exactly who he'd always believed him to be, no matter what anyone else thought. Commander Drake cleared her throat, drawing attention back. "We're filing a formal commendation with District Command, Civilian Maritime Valor Recognition." "It's rare. That's not necessary," Garrett managed. "It already is." Drake's expression softened just fractionally. "And Mr. Wade, the next time you decide to conduct an unauthorized rescue operation, maybe give us a heads up first." The crowd dispersed slowly, people returning to damaged boats and interrupted work. But the energy had changed from panic to purpose. They'd seen what preparation looked like when it met crisis, had watched someone respond to chaos with competence instead of status, and something in the marina's careful hierarchy had cracked wide enough that light was getting through. Margaret stood alone near the harbor master's office, staring at her phone like it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask yet. Garrett walked past, heading back toward his boat where Cole and Rusty waited, but her voice stopped him. 24 hours. That's what the magistrate gave you." Garrett turned. "Yes, ma'am. I'm withdrawing the complaint. The boat stays. Slip 12. Temporary berth. No fees until you're established." He studied her face, looking for the angle, the condition she'd attached to make it charity instead of correction. "Why?" "Because I've spent 3 years trying to control this marina, and you just spent 2 hours showing me what actual safety looks like." She paused, something vulnerable flickering behind her eyes. "My daughter is alive. Because you prepared for a situation you had no reason to expect. That's not luck, Mr. Wade. That's competence I need to learn from." Garrett nodded slowly. "Fair rate when I can pay it, not before." Margaret's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Fair." The rain started as Garrett climbed back aboard his boat, scattered drops at first, then steady, the kind of rain that meant business. Cole handed him a towel without being asked, and Rusty appeared with coffee in a thermos that had seen better decades. "Hell of a day," the mechanic said quietly. Garrett dried his face, feeling exhaustion settle into muscles that had been running on adrenaline and old training for the past 3 hours. "It's not over yet. Storm's still coming." Around them, the marina had transformed. Crews worked with new urgency, following procedures they'd skipped that morning, checking lines twice instead of assuming once was enough. Travis coordinated with the Coast Guard cutter that remained on station, Drake's voice carrying across the water with commands that people actually obeyed now. And at slip 12, the condemned boat sat quiet and ready, reinforced hull absorbing the first serious waves without complaint, systems operating exactly as Garrett had designed them to operate, proof that preparation outlasted contempt every single time. Cole settled beside him on the deck, lunchbox balanced on his knees. "They're not laughing anymore." "No," Garrett agreed, watching crews secure vessels with the kind of attention to detail they should have been using all along. "They're not." But he knew something they didn't yet, something the storm would teach them in 56 hours when Iris made landfall and tested every assumption the marina had made about safety and survival. The real work hadn't started. This was just everyone finally waking up to realize that the condemned boat mechanic understood physics better than their insurance policies did, and that when water stopped caring about your portfolio, preparation was the only currency that mattered. The wind picked up again, colder now, carrying the smell of deep ocean and gathering strength. Garrett checked his phone one last time. Storm track unchanged, intensity increasing, all the signs pointing towards something that would separate the prepared from the pretenders in ways money couldn't fix. He looked at Cole, at Rusty, at the marina that had dismissed him yesterday and needed him today. Tomorrow would bring the real test. Not of boats or cleats or insurance policies, but of whether people could learn fast enough to survive what they'd spent years refusing to see coming. The rain drummed harder against the deck, and Garrett Wade closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of something inevitable building offshore, counting down toward a reckoning that wouldn't care who owned what or who had laughed at whom. It would only care who'd prepared and who hadn't. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear poorly masked. Margaret sat beside Lauren's bed, watching her daughter sleep under thin blankets, IV line running clear fluid into veins that had nearly stopped pumping 6 hours ago. The girl's chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity, each breath a small miracle Margaret hadn't earned. Lauren's eyes opened slowly, focusing with effort. "Mom." Margaret's hand found her daughter's, squeezed carefully around the hospital bracelet. "I'm here, baby. You're safe." He didn't look scared. Lauren's voice came out rough, damaged by salt water and trauma. "When he pulled me up. Everyone else was terrified, but he just knew what to do." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, 3 years of careful control fracturing under the weight of what she'd almost lost. "I was terrified. I stood on that pier and I couldn't do anything except watch the water and pray, not him." Lauren coughed, winced. He looked calm, like he'd done it 1,000 times. The words landed with surgical precision, cutting through every assumption Margaret had built since Daniel died. Her husband had panicked when the yacht started taking water, had made every wrong decision in sequence until the only choice left was drowning. Garrett Wade had made every right decision, moved with the kind of certainty that came from training. Margaret hadn't known existed beneath grease-stained gloves and patched work pants. "I couldn't save your father." The confession tore itself free, 3 years of guilt finally finding voice. "I thought if I controlled everything, every boat, every person, every rule, I could save you. But I was just scared. I was just so scared of losing you the way I lost him." Lauren's fingers tightened. Dad died because he didn't prepare. That man prepared for everything. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears she hadn't allowed herself since the funeral track hot down her face. Outside the window, rain streaked glass in patterns that looked like the ocean trying to follow them inland, reminding her that water didn't care about control or grief or how much money you spent building walls against it. Her phone buzzed. Walter Caldwell, the board's vice president. She answered without greeting. "Emergency session in 1 hour." His voice carried the smooth authority of old money and older assumptions. "We need damage assessment and liability review before this storm gets worse." "I'll be there," Margaret managed, then disconnected before Walter could outline whatever strategy he'd already decided would protect the marina's insurance status over its actual safety. She kissed Lauren's forehead, promised to return soon, and drove through rain that had intensified from steady to punishing. The windshield wipers couldn't keep pace, and Margaret found herself thinking about Garrett Wade navigating worse conditions without hesitation. Reading water the way she read quarterly reports. The marina's conference room held the entire board, 8 members in business casual, coffee going cold in expensive mugs, windows showing a harbor that looked angrier than it had at dawn. Walter sat at the head of the table, silver hair perfect despite humidity that had turned Margaret's own into something unmanageable. "Let's begin." Walter opened a leather portfolio. Initial damage assessment shows 17 vessels with hull damage, 4 dock sections requiring replacement, and 1 complete mooring failure. Insurance carrier is demanding full incident report before storm landfall. Margaret took her seat, feeling water from her jacket seep into the chair's fabric. "My daughter almost died this morning." The room went quiet. Walter's expression flickered, sympathy competing with impatience, before settling on something that looked rehearsed. "We're grateful for the positive outcome, Margaret, but the marina has broader concerns." "Broader than a 16-year-old drowning?" Her voice came out sharper than intended. Walter sighed. "The insurance renewal is next month. Carrier is requiring full safety audit or they cancel coverage. Without insurance, we shut down. 200 slips, 40 million in assets, gone." "Then we do the audit," Margaret replied. "We implement whatever changes they require." "At what cost?" Another board member, a developer who'd made his fortune flipping beachfront property. The preliminary estimate is $2.3 million. New cleats, reinforced posts, electrical system overhaul, emergency protocols we've never needed. We needed them today, Margaret shot back. We needed them when my daughter went into the water and our rescue boats couldn't reach her because nobody thought about draft depth in shallow zones. Walter leaned forward, voice dropping into the patronizing register he used when explaining obvious things to people he considered less informed. Margaret, I understand you're emotional, but we can't make infrastructure decisions based on one incident. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't support. A man is sitting at slip 12 who calculated our surge vulnerability 3 weeks ago. Margaret cut him off cleanly. He warned that our cleat spacing would fail under rebound load. He was right. Walter's jaw tightened. The dock mechanic? You're proposing we take engineering advice from someone who couldn't afford membership fees? I'm proposing we listen to someone who understands physics better than our insurance consultants. Margaret pulled out her phone, opened the photos she'd taken earlier of damaged cleats and snapped lines. These failures weren't random. They were predictable, and he predicted them. Another board member cleared his throat. With respect, Margaret, your judgment may be compromised by gratitude. This Wade person performed a rescue, yes, but that doesn't qualify him to dictate policy. He doesn't need to dictate. He needs to inform. There's a difference. Walter closed his portfolio with deliberate care. The board has already discussed this. We'll file the incident as act of God, claim storm damage through existing coverage, and defer any major upgrades until next fiscal year. It's cleaner, cheaper, and protects our renewal status. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. You're planning to bury the safety violations. We're planning to protect the marina's financial viability. Walter's voice stayed level, reasonable. These upgrades would bankrupt half our members. We'd lose slips, revenue, everything we've built. One near drowning doesn't justify destroying the entire operation. My daughter isn't a near drowning. She's a warning. Margaret stood, planting both hands on the table. The next storm won't care about our fiscal year or our member fees. It'll care whether we prepared or pretended everything was fine. You're being dramatic, the developer muttered. Margaret turned on him. Then explain why 17 boats sustained damage in conditions we claimed to be equipped for. Explain why our rescue vessels couldn't operate in our own harbor. Explain why a condemned boat outperformed every yacht we certified as safe. Silence settled heavy and uncomfortable. Walter exchanged glances with 2 other members, some unspoken communication passing between them. Margaret, perhaps you should recuse yourself from this discussion. Your personal involvement is clouding. The conference room door opened without warning. Garrett Wade stood in the entrance, work boots leaving wet prints on carpet that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. Rusty Polk stood behind him, tool belt still strapped on, and Travis Boone hovered uncertainly at the edge like he wasn't sure he had permission to be there. Mr. Wade, Walter's voice could have frozen the harbor. This is a closed board meeting. Garrett pulled a folded document from his jacket, water-stained but readable. You're planning to hide audit failures. That's insurance fraud. Walter's face flushed. That's a serious accusation from someone with no legal standing. It's a fact from someone who measured your infrastructure 3 weeks ago and documented every violation. Garrett spread the papers across the table. Engineering calculations, annotated photos, stress analysis that would have cost thousands if done by a certified consultant. Your cleat spacing fails code by 8 inches. Shore power is exposed in 6 locations. You have no emergency shutoff protocols for fuel systems. The board members stared at the documentation like it had materialized from another dimension. Margaret picked up a page, scanning calculations that proved Garrett hadn't been guessing when he'd predicted failures. He'd known, had measured and calculated and prepared while everyone else had assumed status quo meant safety. This goes public, we lose everything, Walter stated flatly. The insurance carrier will cancel immediately, pending litigation will multiply. Members will flee to other marinas. If it doesn't go public, the next storm kills someone. Garrett's voice stayed level, delivering facts without judgment. Maybe not Margaret's daughter, maybe someone else's son. The weight of that statement pressed against everyone in the room. Margaret watched Walter's expression cycle through calculation and denial before landing on something that looked like trapped anger. "What do you want?" Walter demanded. "Money? A slip upgrade? Whatever leverage you think this gives you, I want you to do the right thing." Garrett met his stare without flinching. "Implement the safety protocols. Fix the infrastructure. Stop pretending preparation is optional." The developer laughed, a short, bitter sound. "And who pays for it? You? The membership fees barely cover operating costs as is." "Then raise them," Margaret heard herself say. "Charge what it costs to run a safe marina instead of subsidizing status with shortcuts." Walter turned on her. "You're actually siding with him? After everything we've built here? Everything we built almost killed my daughter this morning." Her voice came out quiet but absolute. "I'm done pretending that's acceptable." The room fractured into argument, half the board siding with Walter's financial pragmatism, half recognizing that Margaret and Garrett were describing reality while everyone else was defending fantasy. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, and through it all, Garrett stood silent, letting the truth he'd documented speak louder than any defense. Travis's radio crackled. All board members needed at the main dock, immediately. They filed out in tense silence. Margaret beside Garrett, Walter bringing up the rear with fury radiating off him like heat. Outside, the rain had become something biblical, sheets of water reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. The main dock pitched under wave action that had intensified dramatically in the last hour, and a group of crew members stood clustered near slip 14 where a 70-foot yacht was listing at an angle that meant serious hull breach. "That's Mason Caldwell's boat," Rusty observed quietly. "Walter's grandson." The yacht groaned, metal protesting as water found new ways inside through seams that should have been watertight but weren't. Mason himself stood on the dock, maybe 10 years old, soaked through and crying while his father tried to salvage equipment before the boat sank entirely. Walter moved toward them, then stopped, turned back to Garrett. "Can you save it?" Garrett studied the yacht for maybe 5 seconds. "No, hull's compromised below the waterline, but I can keep it from taking the dock section with it when it goes down." "Do it!" Walter's voice cracked on the command, authority dissolving into desperation. Garrett moved with Travis and Rusty, directing crew to shift weight, release specific lines, create controlled failure instead of catastrophic collapse. Cole appeared from somewhere, handing his father tools without being asked, moving with the same fluid competence that came from weeks of working together in tight spaces. Margaret watched her board members watch Garrett work. This man they'd dismissed, whose expertise they'd questioned, whose boat they'd tried to tow away. He was saving Walter's grandson's vessel from destroying infrastructure that would cost hundreds of thousands to replace. Doing it without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. Just competence applied to crisis the way some people breathed. The yacht settled slowly as Garrett bled off pressure points and redistributed stress. It would still sink, still represent a total loss. But it would sink cleanly instead of taking everything around it down too. When the last line was secured and the immediate danger passed, Walter stood staring at his grandson who'd stopped crying and started watching Garrett with something close to awe. Mason tugged his grandfather's sleeve. "That man's really good at this." Walter's expression did something complicated, pride colliding with humiliation, gratitude fighting resentment, before settling into exhausted acceptance. "Yes, he is." The board reconvened an hour later, everyone soaked and shaken, coffee replaced by something stronger from Walter's private stock. The votes came quickly once pretense stopped being sustainable. Implement all safety upgrades, unanimous, raise membership fees to cover costs, 7-1, Walter abstaining. Hire Garrett Wade as consultant, 6-2, Walter voting against but not blocking. Margaret walked out with the signed contracts feeling lighter than she had in 3 years, like some weight she'd been carrying since Daniel died had finally been set down. She found Garrett at Slip 12 working on his boat while Cole handed him tools in the fading light. It's official. She held up the paperwork. Full safety audit starting tomorrow, upgrades beginning as soon as materials arrive. And the board wants to retain you as consultant. $40 an hour part-time teaching our crews what they should have learned years ago. Garrett wiped his hands, considering. What about the condemned tag? Gone. Margaret managed something close to a smile. Turns out the boat was never the problem. The people judging it were. Cole grinned up at his father, pride radiating off him in waves that needed no translation. Garrett's expression softened in ways Margaret suspected few people got to see, walls coming down around his son that stayed firmly in place everywhere else. There's something else, Margaret continued. Commander Drake is filing formal commendation with Coast Guard District Command. Civilian maritime valor recognition. She says it's rare. Garrett shook his head. That's not necessary. She was very clear that it already is. Margaret studied him, trying to reconcile the man who'd saved her daughter with the one everyone had dismissed as barely competent. Why did you leave the Navy? Your record says medical discharge, but you clearly still have the skills. The question hung between them, and for a moment Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Then Garrett looked at Cole, at the boy who trusted him completely, and something in his expression shifted. Hurricane Michael Relief Operation 2018, Florida Keys, civilian rescue in storm surge conditions. My teammate Marcus Holt got tangled in anchor cable underwater, visibility 0, time running out. I had to choose between cutting fast and risking his femoral artery, or working slow and watching him drown. Margaret felt her breath catch. What did you do? Cut fast. He survived. Lost his leg below the knee, but survived. Garrett's voice stayed steady, delivering facts that clearly still carried weight. I couldn't do the job anymore after that. Kept seeing that choice every time I went underwater. Medical board called it PTSD, gave me discharge papers, and I spent 6 years convincing myself I'd made the right call. Until today, Margaret finished quietly. Until today. When I had to make the same choice with your daughter and the training came back like I'd never stopped. Cole was watching his father with new understanding, pieces clicking together about scars and slants, and why Garrett sometimes woke up at night from dreams he wouldn't discuss. The boy reached out, touched his father's hand, and Garrett's fingers closed around his with the kind of grip that meant everything words couldn't carry. Margaret's phone buzzed, the hospital calling to say Lauren was asking for her. She excused herself, drove back through rain that showed no signs of stopping, and found her daughter sitting up in bed with color returning to her face. Mom, I want to learn what he knows. Lauren's voice came out stronger now, determined. How to read water, how to prepare, how to not panic when everything goes wrong. Margaret settled into the chair beside the bed. We'll ask him. I suspect he's a good teacher. They sat together while rain drummed against the window and Lauren drifted back to sleep. And Margaret thought about the difference between control and competence, between building walls and building foundations. Daniel had died because he'd been too proud to prepare, too certain that experience meant invulnerability. Garrett had survived because he'd never stopped respecting what water could do. Never assumed that yesterday's calm guaranteed tomorrow's safety. 6 weeks passed in a blur of construction and training. The marina transformed, new cleats installed to proper spacing, electrical systems isolated and protected, emergency shutoffs integrated throughout the fuel delivery network. Garrett ran workshops for crew members who showed up eager to learn, instead of resentful about being taught, and slowly the culture shifted from status-focused to safety-conscious. Cole's custody hearing arrived on a humid August morning that threatened thunderstorms but held off long enough for Garrett to wear his one good shirt and stand before a family court judge who'd already reviewed supplemental evidence neither lawyer had anticipated. "Your Honor," Jennifer's attorney began, "Mr. Wade's employment history shows $18 an hour dock maintenance, insufficient for stable child-rearing environment." The judge held up a hand. "I've reviewed additional documentation submitted by Harborview Marina Board and Coast Guard District Command." She looked at Garrett over reading glasses. "Mr. Wade, you recently performed civilian rescue resulting in preservation of life under hazardous conditions?" "Yes, ma'am." Garrett kept his answer simple. "And you've been retained as maritime safety consultant at $40 per hour with Coast Guard training contract pending?" "Yes, ma'am." Jennifer leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while we're pleased Mr. Wade has found additional income, the fundamental concerns about stability remain." The judge cut him off with a look that could have frozen the Outer Banks. "Mrs. Patterson, your client remarried into financial security." "Mr. Wade rebuilt his life through competence and determination. Both parents appear capable. I'm denying the petition for custody modification." Cole's hand found Garrett's under the table, squeezed hard enough to leave marks. Jennifer sat very still, then stood and walked to where Garrett waited in the hallway after the judge dismissed them. "I wanted him to have stability." Her voice carried none of the hostility Garrett had expected. "I thought that meant money, security, the things Richard could provide." "It means showing up," Garrett replied quietly. "It means being there when he needs someone who won't quit on him." Jennifer nodded slowly. "He's lucky to have you." Then she walked away, heels clicking against courthouse tile, and Garrett felt something unclench in his chest that had been tight since the day she'd filed papers. Outside, Cole tackled him in a hug that nearly knocked both of them over, and Garrett held on longer than he needed to, feeling his son's heartbeat against his ribs, and thinking about all the ways he could have lost this if the storm hadn't forced everyone to see past their assumptions. They drove back to the marina where preparations for the second workshop were already underway. Margaret had volunteered to help, and Garrett found her setting up chairs with the kind of careful attention to detail that had shifted from controlling outcomes to creating conditions where good outcomes became possible. "My daughter wants to volunteer as junior sailing instructor," Margaret mentioned as Garrett checked the projector setup, teaching safety protocols to younger kids. "I think having someone her age making it cool might reach them better than adults lecturing." Garrett smiled. "She's got the right teacher. So do we all, apparently." Margaret handed him the workshop attendance sheet. 43 sign-ups. That's triple last month. People learn fastest when they're scared." Garrett scanned the names. Yacht owners mixed with dock workers, teenagers alongside retirees, the whole economic spectrum of the harbor represented. The trick is keeping them learning after the fear fades. The workshop ran 3 hours, Garrett demonstrating knot techniques and emergency procedures while Cole circulated with equipment, and Lauren helped younger kids understand why preparation mattered more than expensive gear. Mason Caldwell sat in the front row taking careful notes, and Walter watched his grandson with expression that had moved from contempt to something approaching respect for the man teaching. Afterward, people lingered instead of rushing away. Questions became conversations, and Garrett found himself explaining tidal dynamics to a retired engineer who'd owned boats for 30 years without understanding why they behaved differently in storm conditions. "You make it seem obvious," the engineer observed. "Like anyone should know this. Anyone who needs to survive should know this," Garrett corrected gently. The ocean doesn't care if you took a weekend safety course or memorized licensing requirements. It cares whether you prepared for what it can do. Travis approached as the crowd dispersed. Coast Guard acceptance letter visible in his back pocket. I'm supposed to report to Academy in 2 weeks. But Commander Drake said if I defer 6 months, I can work with you on the district training program they're developing. Garrett studied the kid who'd called to warn him about the board complaint, who'd helped secure boats during the storm, who'd chosen competence over procedural caution when Lauren was drowning. What do you want to do? Travis looked at the harbor, at boats secured properly now, at crews who'd learned to check lines twice instead of assuming once was enough. I want to do what you did. Learn it right, then teach it to people who need it. Then defer, Garrett advised. The Academy will still be there in 6 months. The chance to build something that saves lives might not. Margaret found him later, after everyone had left and the sun was dropping toward the horizon in shades of copper and gold. She'd brought coffee in a thermos that actually kept things hot, and they sat on the deck of Slip 12 watching light fade across water that had stopped trying to kill things and returned to its usual indifference. The board approved something else, Margaret said quietly. Permanent berth assignment, Slip 12, your name on the contract, standard rate that you've more than earned through consulting work. Garrett accepted the coffee, felt warmth seep through the cup into hands that had handled a lot of cold water over the years. Thank you. She smiled and it reached her eyes this time, genuine instead of performative. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You saved my daughter. You saved this marina. You saved me from becoming my worst self. The right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same, Garrett observed. Watching Cole and Lauren at the end of the pier feeding seagulls that had learned their routine. But choosing right becomes easier when you stop pretending there's a shortcut. Margaret nodded, sitting with that truth while the harbor settled into evening rhythms. Somewhere out beyond the breakwater, water rolled in patterns that wouldn't threaten anything tonight but would test everything eventually. Storms always came back. The question was whether you'd be ready when they did. 6 months later, on a February morning cold enough to frost the deck railings, Cole helped Garrett rename the boat in a small ceremony attended by more people than either of them expected. The condemned tag was long gone, replaced by fresh registration and a name Cole had chosen after weeks of consideration, Second Chance, painted in bold letters across the stern. Because that's what it was, for Garrett's career, for his relationship with his son, for a marina that had learned the difference between appearing safe and being prepared. Margaret showed up with Lauren, both of them in practical jackets instead of the designer clothes that had marked their old lives. Commander Drake sent a representative with official Coast Guard training certification for Garrett's district consulting role. Travis was there, academy-bound but returning summers to help with workshops. Rusty brought beer that was too early to drink but traditional enough that nobody commented. Mason Caldwell approached Garrett, his grandfather's hand on his shoulder but the boy moving forward alone. Mr. Wade, I wanted to apologize for what I said to Cole about the boat being junk. Cole materialized beside his father and the two boys faced each other with the careful assessment of former enemies reconsidering terms. Mason extended his hand. Your dad's pretty cool. Cole shook it, grinning. Yeah, I know. Walter stood apart, watching his grandson learn humility from a 9-year-old who'd never needed to learn it because his father had taught him by example. The old man caught Garrett's eye, managed a nod that wasn't quite friendship but was definitely no longer contempt, and Garrett nodded back because some victories didn't require acknowledgement beyond that. The ceremony ended. People dispersed, and Garrett found himself alone with Cole on the deck of their boat. Their boat, legally and actually the first thing they'd owned together that felt permanent. The boy traced the new name with his fingers, careful and reverent. It's perfect, Cole decided. Garrett settled beside him, looking across a harbor that bore the marks of preparation now instead of just polish. New cleats stood at proper spacing. Emergency shutoffs were clearly marked. Crews knew protocols instead of just procedures. The transformation had cost money and pride in the comfortable assumption that yesterday's safety guaranteed tomorrow's survival. But it had worked. When the next storm came, because another storm always came, the harbor would be ready in ways it hadn't been before Garrett Wade bought a condemned boat and refused to accept that status meant more than skill. Margaret appeared at the slip, hesitant in ways she never used to be, vulnerability replacing the armor of certainty she'd worn when they met. Would you want to see how she handles? Real conditions, not just dock trials. Garrett stood, offered his hand to help her aboard. She took it without hesitation, and Lauren followed, and Cole grinned because apparently the whole thing had been planned without Garrett's knowledge or approval, but with complete faith that he'd say yes. They cast off together, 4 people who'd been strangers 6 months ago, but had become something more complicated than friends. Survivors of shared crisis, teachers and students of lessons the ocean had forced them to learn. The boat handled beautifully, responding to conditions with the stability Garrett had engineered and the competence time had proven. As they navigated past the breakwater into open water, Margaret stood beside Garrett at the wheel, watching him read currents she was only beginning to understand. They laughed at the condemned boat, she observed quietly. But what's condemned can be rebuilt. What's broken can be fixed, Garrett agreed, thinking about Marcus Holt and second chances and the difference between giving up and giving yourself permission to start over. And what's lost can be found again, if you're willing to do the work. Cole and Lauren had moved to the bow, pointing at something beneath the surface that only kids seemed able to spot, and their laughter carried back across the deck like proof that preparation and faith weren't opposites. They were partners in the kind of survival that mattered most. The harbor fell away behind them, safe and ready, transformed not by money or status but by competence earned through preparation and applied when crisis demanded it. And Garrett Wade, former Navy rescue diver turned dock mechanic turned consultant, turned his face toward open water and felt something settle that had been restless since the day he'd cut a cable and watched his teammate bleed. He'd made the right choice both times, and that knowledge, earned through survival instead of assumption, was worth more than any commendation or contract or slip assignment could ever measure. The ocean rolled beneath them, indifferent and eternal, waiting for the next test that would separate preparation from pretense. But today, on the renamed Second Chance, carrying people who'd learned to respect water instead of trying to control it, Garrett Wade let himself believe that maybe sometimes getting it right the second time was exactly what redemption looked like.